You are listening to the e-flux podcast.
Hello. In this episode, Charles Mudede will read his text, White Knee, Black Neck, published in the June 2020 issue of e-flux Journal. Charles Mudede is a Zimbabwean-born cultural critic, urbanist, filmmaker, and writer. Mudede, who teaches at Cornish College of the Arts, collaborated with the director Robinson Devor on 2 films, Police Beat and Zoo, both of which premiered at Sundance. Zoo was also screened at Cannes Film Festival. Mudede is associate editor for The Stranger, a Seattle weekly, and directed the 2020 film Thin Skin. You can find a link to the full text in the show notes. Hi, Charles.
Hey,
How are you?
not bad, Aaron.
So you'll be reading for us today. Do you want to give a brief introduction?
Yes, this piece was written a few weeks after Chaz, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, opened in Seattle. And there was a lot of questions about policing because the triggering event for the Autonomous Zone was the abandonment of the East Precinct in Capitol Hill by the police. And so this was interesting to me, and it opened up an opportunity for the protesters to pretty much extend the protest for a month. The hope was something would come out of it that was long term, but it didn't happen that way. The police moved in eventually and removed the protesters and the art that was covered all over that section of Capitol Hill. So this really comes out of that moment. It's my sort of Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone article.
Great.
I'm Charles Mudede, and this piece of writing is called White Knee, Black Neck. This is not in the piece, but I want to just say this very quickly. The first part of this article is inspired, of course, by Badu, Elaine Badu, and he says, when you philosophize, you must always begin at the beginning. And so here I begin at the beginning, and that is the question, what do the police do? Let's begin with the police. What is it exactly that these armed men and women do for a living? They protect the rights of property ownership. All else follows from this primary objective. Even the 18th century moral philosopher Adam Smith was aware of the key police function. In The Wealth of Nations, the first systematic defense of ownership society, he wrote, "For one very rich man, there must be at least 500 poor, and the affluence of the few supposes the indigence of the many. The affluence of the rich excites the indignation of the poor, who are often both driven by want and prompted by envy to invade his possessions. It is only under the shelter of the civil magistrate that the owner of that valuable property, which is acquired by the labor of many years, or perhaps of many successive generations, can sleep a single night in security. He is at all times surrounded by unknown enemies, whom, though he never provoked, he can never appease, and from whose injustice he can be protected only by the powerful arm of the civil magistrate continually held up to chastise it. The acquisition of valuable and extensive property, therefore, necessarily requires the establishment of civil government. Where there is no property, or at least none that exceeds the value of 2 or 3 days' labor, civil government is not so necessary." And there you have it. Smith stated as plainly as possible, and without even a sense of scandal or embarrassment, that the function of law enforcement in a market-based society is to protect the order of property ownership. Penal population. If we begin with this understanding that police protect property and their owners, we can expect this to be its primary consequence. Those who have very little property in a community are bound to experience a frequency of bad encounters with law enforcement that is much higher than those who have a lot of property. And so it is. What we find in the US, the world's top ownership society for the past 100 years, is a vast jail, prison, and parole system filled with men and women who do not own much of anything. From this fact, which links poverty to the business of policing, we also find an explanation for the overrepresentation of Black Americans in the US's state prisons. Blacks make up about 13% of the general population, but make up 40% of the penal population. The logic of ownership society. After the abolition of slavery in the US, blacks received no compensation from ownership society because they did not lose any property. They were indeed the property that was lost. This outcome, no compensation for slaves, can only make sense in a society that has sacralized property rights. Soon after the Haitian Revolution ended in 1804, for example, the former slaves were forced into debt by their former owners. The black nation had to pay France 90 million francs, or 21 billion US dollars in today's money. This debt was not repaid until 1947. The Haitian slave revolt, the struggle for freedom, violated a property contract. The same is true for the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 that freed slaves in the U.S. This violation of a contract explains, in part, the U.S.'s refusal to come anywhere close to adequately compensating Black Americans for over 250 years of slavery. What is to be compensated? To make this manner of reasoning a little more obvious, one only has to consider the reparations to Japanese Americans for internment during much of World War II. The award came late for sure, 1988, but it was always politically feasible because many in this group lost property when they were forced to relocate to concentration camps in 1942. Much of this property was never returned after the war. The U.S. government had to finally recognize the racial grievance of the internment because it contained a large number of property grievances. An official apology was offered for the state's brazen racism, and in recognition of lost property and revenue, $1.6 billion worth of checks were sent to those who had been interned and their heirs. The Black history of a bad check. What we find in the years that follow the Emancipation Proclamation are a series of bad checks sent from the state to Black Americans. By 1963, the March on Washington, or the Freedom March, made the then most recent of these bad checks, the post-war Keynesian check that was good for the whites who swelled the middle class of the U.S.'s social hierarchy, the prime issue of the event. In the words of the march's main speaker, the theologian Martin Luther King Jr., America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. It is not an accident that King associated American freedom with American money, which offers the means to own what the police officers are hired to protect, property. Martin Luther King Jr. We refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this country. And so we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us, upon demand, the riches of freedom and the security of justice. This check has yet to not bounce. The putative turn. 6 years after the March on Washington, the U.S. government began channeling surplus black labor into an expanding prison system. The sociologist Bruce Western described this switch point in his 2006 book, Punishment and Inequality in America, as the U.S.'s punitive turn. Mass incarceration had a definite Keynesian function in the sense that it provided the government with an investment opportunity that would not be opposed by the right, whose economic program was, at that time, the late 1960s and early 1970s, making a return after 30 years in the wilderness. It was understood that the government's demand function could not be aborted at this point. This would have resulted in mass unemployment and a return to the political turbulence that nearly toppled ownership society during the Red Decade, the 1930s. The Keynesian demand function was instead repurposed. Western writes, prison construction became an instrument for regional development as small towns lobbied for construction facilities and resisted prison closure. 3 decades after the punitive turn, over 1 million black children, 9% of those under 18, had a father in jail. Invisible men and women. This massive program of incarceration had another Keynesian function. It made many jobless men and women invisible. We can describe this disappearing act as Keynesian because it helped the government maintain its 30-year commitment to full employment, the solution to the class conflicts of the Red Decade. A grasp of this development is improved by the recognition of black exclusion from the middle class that ballooned during the course of the long boom, 1947 to 1970. What happened to them? Black Americans kept pressing for their check: full employment, job security, health insurance, and high wages to be cleared. But in the end, the only significant Keynesian program the state granted the descendants of slaves was joblessness in the form of mass incarceration, which, as Bruce Western points out, removed a large amount of unemployment from the books and made full employment possible in a period that experienced a decline in the rate of capital accumulation, the 1970s. Western writes, prison and jail inmates are invisible in the official labor statistics that describe the economic well-being of the population. Western estimates that the jobless rate for blacks in the U.S. would go up by as much as 10% if the prison population was included in national accounts. The pacification of white labor. What is poorly understood by most Americans is that the golden age of capitalism, or what the French call the 30 glorious years, was at once a period of full employment and intense labor turbulence. Mainstream history, even on the left, Robert Reich, Nick Hanauer, Paul Krugman, and the like, tends to portray it as a period of peace between labor and capital. Wages were high, as was the rate of capital accumulation. It was a win-win situation that was unwisely destroyed in 1980 by the Volcker shock, which crushed union power and the subsequent deregulation of financial markets. But the high wages of the Golden Age were tied to labor capital contracts that put a lid on radical labor activism and diminished the power of unions. This was the consequence of the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947 and the Treaty of Detroit in 1950. The act and treaty were the two blades of a scissors that worked to cut the sinews of labor's greatest strength, grassroots activism. It also pacified much of white labor. El Nuevo Rodeo. At this point, let's consider the police officer who used his knee to murder George Floyd. Derek Chauvin's income as a servant of the rights of property apparently did not make ends meet. He moonlighted as a bouncer for a popular Minneapolis Mexican-American music venue called El Nuevo Rodeo. He, as with millions of other middle-class white Americans, earned less than the socially necessary income to maintain a middle-class standard of life. If the Keynesian response to black unemployment was mass incarceration, its response to a white middle class accustomed to high wages in a period of flat to declining real wages was what the sociologist Lisa Adkins calls in her 2019 book, The Time of Money, the financialization of everyday life. As borrowing fueled middle-class consumption, hard cash, which was harder and harder to obtain, became increasingly valuable. If Officer Chauvin's position was similar to that of millions of Americans in the middle class, then he needed not more credit, but more cash. This difficult state of affairs can be explained by the transference of national deficit spending on the maintenance of a socially approved standard of life to the realm of domestic deficit spending. This transference had the advantage of maintaining the Keynesian demand function as government budgets contracted. The corner of 38th and Chicago Avenue. And yet, a large section of white America was surprised to see, on Memorial Day, in the middle of a pandemic, the knee of a white police officer choking the life out of a black man pinned to a Minneapolis street. It seemed not to make any sense to them. Why would a police officer do such a thing? But if we fix the frame of Adam Smith's understanding of the police function on the incident, little about it will seem out of place. The black man in question has very little property. He's unemployed at the time of his death, and when employed, he was a bouncer at El Nuevo Rodeo. The lockdown closed the venue. In fact, Floyd, who, like 15% of all black males alive today, had spent time in prison, and who also tested positive for COVID-19 on April 4, 2020, was accused of having used a fake $20 bill to buy cigarettes from a store, Cup Foods, on the corner of 38th and Chicago Avenue. This was the beginning of the end for him. The possible loss of $20 and the possession of a packet of cigarettes that he may not have had the right to own. As for the white man whose knee is on Floyd's neck, he has a job to do, to serve and protect the rights of property ownership. And here, as the knee presses on Floyd's neck, we can draw a conclusion from an insight that Karl Marx made in a number of his books, and which, in a sense, extended Hegel's theory of recognition. The slave sees their value in things. In Marx's view, under a property regime, a society that has sacralized possessions, we find that people have been replaced in importance by things. This means that objects or commodities mediate our relations with other humans. This is what being in a commodity society comes down to. The police in such a regime then do not serve and protect people, but things.